Welcome to Fundamental Friday, a weekly series created by the Percussive Art Society. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. For some of you, I think for our buddy Mark Powers out there in Portland, it's morning, right?
10 a.m. over here.
Excellent, excellent. Mark Powers is a member of the drum set committee. He's a member of my committee. My name is Eric C. Hughes. I'm the drum set committee chairman. And Mark is a member of the committee. He's been with us for a while. And today he's going to talk about tuning. But before we get to that, if you have any questions during this broadcast, please make sure you put those in the comments. And we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. After we're done here today, the video will be saved on the PAS Facebook page, as well as on the PAS YouTube channel. You can also find all of our past Fundamental Friday videos on pas.org under resources. So, Mark, welcome.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
Glad you're here. Let's talk about some tuning today.
All right. Well, since we have a short period of time today, we decided to kind of do a little bit of a drum tuning quick start. So I will just use this rack tom for right now to just kind of show a couple of the simple steps that I normally show my students. And this is where I start. As you certainly know, there really is no right or wrong way to tune a drum necessarily, as long as the end result is what your ear wants for the sound you're producing for a song, if you're recording, or just in the band room or wherever you're working out. That is usually most important. I would say that 95% of my drum students are trying to get a little bit of a rock, kind of punchy sound out of their kit for the most part. There's some things I would do differently if I'm tuning for jazz, but we'll just kind of start off with a little bit of a rock sound. So there is definitely a relationship between the top and bottom heads, and the relative tension between those two can affect things a lot. I normally start by tuning the bottom head, and I normally put it down on something like a drum throne, which I have here, or on the floor, because if you're tapping the drum head and it's suspended on something, you hear the entire drum at the same time, which isn't necessarily always bad, because we want to do that eventually. But for starters, I want to muffle that bottom head a little bit in one way or another. And if I'm actually trying to do this on a gig and it's not convenient to take the toms off of a kit in the middle of something, I might even try using my knee or another hand to kind of muffle the bottom head a little bit. And starting with the bottom head, in this case, I've detuned this so it's pretty flabby and loose, and definitely not a desirable sound by any stretch. The first thing I normally do is just start tensioning things up, either just by hand or with the drum key, just to the point where you start to feel the slightest bit of pressure. For a lot of people's drums, that would just be that finger tight spot where you start to feel resistance tuning up with your fingers. You're not going to be able to get much further without using a key. And as I do that, pretty much all of the time, I'm trying to work in a little bit of a star fashion, which some people are probably familiar with, where if I start bringing a little tension up on this tension rod, the next one I'll address is opposite it. And then depending on how many lugs you have, if you have 8 lugs, I might go to the sides. This tom has 6. So I'm just creating a little bit of a 6-pointed star configuration, working on the lug in all the slightest bit of tension on each of those, just to start to get up to what I would call that finger tight place. And with these hook lugs on this particular kit, it's actually really great because you can hear a little bit of looseness just in the lug itself. So when I hear that disappear on each of them, I know I've gotten to the point I want to get. That's not going to be the final place we stop, because it's not going to sound fantastic just yet. But what I do at this point is I rest one finger in the middle of the head. I'm not putting much pressure down on the head, just resting a finger in the middle so that I'm kind of isolating the sound of each of the lugs. Again, instead of listening to the whole drum, we set the drum down so we're just listening to one head. And putting a finger gently in the middle even further isolates it, so you're mostly hearing the sound around one lug rather than the entire head all at the same time. And I'm just going to tap with the drum key about an inch or so inside, just kind of tapping right about there by each lug with that finger in the middle. And hopefully, even via the web here, you can hear how that one's a little bit lower pitch. And I'm just going to kind of check those out. One thing that's interesting is that typically the two lugs opposite each other will have the same pitch, very commonly. Once in a while, that might not be the case, but since those two are pulling opposite, the tension between those two tends to be pretty consistent across the drum. So I have two that are higher and these four on the outsides are lower. Right now, since I want to be ultimately bringing this tension up a little bit more, I'm just going to bring all of those lower ones up a little bit and just trying to get them a little closer to where I hear those higher ones being. So I'll give those four a little bit more of a tweak. And I'll check again. Those are actually pretty darn close already just by doing that. Since we're going for a little bit of a rock sound, I will generally have a little more tension on the bottom head of the tom. And normally I also have something like a Remo Ambassador, kind of a head about that thickness on the bottom. Whereas on the top, I might have the same head or something thicker. I might use an Ambassador coated or clear. I might do an Emperor or something like that. Some people like a pinstripe for a really fat rock sound. So I know that I'm going to tune this up a little bit higher than I'm going to go on that bottom head. Not super tight, unless I'm dealing with a snare drum to get the crack, but these are pretty close. I might just try bringing each of them the slightest little bit up. And now that they're all about the same pitch, I'm going to try to be consistent with my turns. Again, moving in that star shape around the drum. Check the pitch. A little out of whack there. I'll just try tuning up a couple of those that are a little lower. Maybe once in a while even bring one or two of the higher ones down if I feel I'm getting to a point where the head is in general getting higher than I want it to be. And just like a guitar string, if I do that, if I'm loosening tension on one, I typically loosen it a little bit further than I ultimately want it to be at and then tighten back to that spot. And it's more likely that it'll hold in place in a position where it's being tightened rather than a spot where it's loosened and it's easier for it to keep loosening. So those are pretty good all the way around there. So at this point, we'll switch to the top head, which again, completely detuned. And I'm going to do the same thing. You can hear these little hook lugs rattling a bit, so I'm just going to bring them up to the point where I feel a little bit of tension and I hear that rattle disappear.
Hey, Mark.
Yep.
When you do your initial, on the bottom head, you did an initial turn all around before you fine-tuned it. Would you recommend doing like a quarter turn? Or does that really matter to you when you're tuning your heads?
Honestly, I think that depends on the size of the drum. And I would say that the larger the drum head, especially if it for some reason has fewer lugs, the more I would make a turn. When I get to a small tom, I have a recording custom tom that just has 5 lugs on all the way around. It's a small little 8-inch tom, and that one, every one of my tweaks is really tiny because a quarter would be way too much. But I have a big 18-inch floor tom that I might go at least a quarter on that initial turn to get it up to where I want it. So yeah, I would say that for a mid tom, that quarter turn start might be in general kind of a good place to start, and then go less or more relative to that as you're getting smaller and larger. And another thing that I think is really important is just something I'm telling my students all the time is to do this, even if you don't feel like you know what you're doing on a regular basis. When you're in the practice room and not sure if you like the sound of your drums, just screw around with it, or screw around with it even if you do like them, to figure out if you can detune it and get it back to a place. Because there's no real science to this. I mean, there are certainly some physics involved and people that would argue a number of different specific things you should use. things like a tune bot or a Drumdial, little gadgets like this. And those are awesome, super cool, but also not always practical on the gig. You're on stage during sound check, and the guitar player's making noise and things. And sometimes it's just your ear down to the edge of a drum on your drum throne, trying to get as close as you can really quick, or tuning in between songs. So as you do this and keep experimenting, I think that the number one thing that helps your tuning improve is when you get to that point where you start to feel it, and you almost don't have to hear the drum, and you can kind of feel not only the drum head tension, but that tension at each of those lugs. You can feel when one is a little bit more tight than another, and you loosen that one off a little bit, and you kind of build that intuition just like anything else. And it's amazing how you can get to the point where you can do this almost off feel and pick up the drum, and it sounds pretty darn good. So just doing it all the time is key. So the head's going up a little bit. It is loose, but we're still at a place where the drum's probably not going to sound very ideal. A little flabby in spots there. So I'm going to bring a few of these up. A couple of these low ones. And again, just from experience, I know that chances are those two that were lower there are also going to be low on the opposite side. So sometimes I'll end up tapping 3 lugs on a 6-lug drum, and already kind of know what I want to do without going all the way around.
And if anyone has any questions, please feel free to type them in the chat on the side there, and be happy to pass them along to Mark if you've got any questions about tuning.
So it's getting pretty close. Loosen this a bit. Little trial and error here and there. But we'll try picking this bad boy up. Sounds pretty cool. So
that's pretty good for me.
And again, with that kind of general, what I was calling rock approach, that bottom head a little bit tighter than the top head, especially if the heads are the same type of head, that gives you a little bit of a lower pitch, which you might want for the genre, and punch on that top head. But tightening up that bottom head a little bit starts to kill some of the sustain that you get. You don't necessarily want the drum ringing really long. If I'm going for a warmer, less punchy tone for something in a jazz situation, and again, I have the same types of heads, I might not only get those pitches about the same, or sorry, the tension of the heads close to the same, but also make the pitches about the same, which with many drums might happen naturally when that tension is the same, but others not so much. And that just lets that drum really resonate at that pitch, those tones really come out, and you tend to get more sustain because that bottom head is often a little bit more loose as well. That's where I start.
Cool. Let's. I got a question here. The question is from a director, a band director of a jazz band, and the question is: should the student tune each time he sits down at the kit, or just when he's changing a head? And I think you kind of sort of addressed that a second ago, but if you can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think you have to tune every time you sit down at the kit, but I think you should check to see if you need to tune every time you sit down at the kit, because oftentimes you will. And it's a jazz band director. In situations like that, you have a drum set that's being played by tons of different people. It's like having a house kit at a venue that you show up at. I'm almost always tuning that drum set after somebody else has, because either it's been abused and not really kept in tune, or the prior player just had different preferences and we're just wanting to get different sounds out of it. So I think the same goes on your practice kit at home or the band room kit before jazz rehearsal. Definitely sit down and play the drums and actually think about the sound of the drums. And not just think about the sounds, but whether you like the sounds or not. And then start making those adjustments, because again, you develop a lot of experience just doing that, and you're not just sitting down and playing the instrument and not thinking about the sound you're producing with it. So yeah, I think that if you're waiting only until you're changing heads to tune your drums, that is probably bad news. That would be, again, like the guitar player deciding that they're only going to tune their guitar when they change their strings. That would be absolutely absurd. So
Excellent.
these are, like anything else, something that will detune and go flat on and tighten back up.
Okay. Dave Stark from Florida says hello, by the way.
Dave Stark!
Hey, Dave. I got a question. So you play drum set, and I play drum set, and Dave Stark plays drum set, and all kinds of different bands and stuff like that. So from let's pick rock. Let's pick rock and roll for an example. You play with Floater. They're kind of a more rocking band. How often? Obviously, we all play the snare drum more than probably any drum, snare drum and kick drum probably. How often do you change those heads versus changing the tom heads?
Good question. Certainly playing with Floater, since it's such a heavy gig and I'm playing with larger sticks and just hitting at the volume that I'm hitting with them, drum heads get changed a lot more frequently than they do on my vintage kit that runs around town for local jobbing situations where I'm playing with brushes and things. And in that situation, the heads, I treat that kit almost like the old dirty jazz ride cymbal that you don't want to clean because it's got that awesome patina that gets the sound you want to get. And for those drums, I let the heads stay on there for a while. Since I'm playing a lot of brushes, when the snare head starts wearing off, I have to change it because again, I can't get the sound I want with that instrument anymore. But if I'm playing rock with Floater, if we're going on the road, I normally have a couple changes of drum heads that I know over the period of a couple of weeks, they're going to get swapped out, maybe once a week or something like that. And I know drummers that do more often, depending on the show. And I would say a good rule of thumb is just checking for wear. Again, if it's a school band sort of situation, man, like all of us have seen it when we pop into schools, just the dimples all over a drum. And that's just from drums being played the wrong way, typically just being played with a lot of tension. So they're being hit at rather than the sound being drawn out of them. And most of us, myself included, can remember a period of time when our drums looked like that because you didn't have technique yet and you were battering your drum heads to death and never changing them on top of it. Maybe taking the blow dryer to the head to try to suck a few of the dimples out, horrible things like that. But you get to a point later on where you realize, wow, I'm not doing that to my drums all the time. And hopefully that's the case anyway. And it's because you really developed some technique, you learned how to play. But at school, in the school band room, when those heads start getting really dimpled up or the snare drum starts showing wear and that coating is disappearing, I think it's really an important time to get them changed. Because along with all those dimples goes all the tone out of the drum and everything else. Bass drum heads for me can really vary. If I'm playing with a felt beater, I have some bass drum heads that last months or probably years. But if I'm using something like a maple wood beater, which I really love for sound sometimes, some of the low boy beaters, some of those I get the sound that I want, but they chew through some bass drum heads. So if I'm going on the road and I'm using a punchy wood beater, I've got some backup bass drum heads for sure because you never know what could happen.
Let me ask you a kind of a reverse engineering question. When you change your heads, obviously you detune, but what sort of other maintenance would you do to a drum while you change to put new heads on?
I think one of the most important things to do when you've got the heads off the drum is just to check it out. And that includes things that can cause rattle, like all of the screws and things on the inside, and just make sure that things are tight. Again, the number of times I've been at a school and I've hit a tom on a drum set and heard a rattle and you look in and there's a little screw bouncing around over there. God knows how long that's been just bouncing around inside the drum. So making sure that stuff is good. And then the bearing edge itself, which is just that edge of the drum that touches the head. You really want to make sure that is smooth and undamaged. And especially with less expensive drums, cheaper models, you get little bits of those plies of wood pop out of there. And not only does that mean the drum head is not seated smoothly and tightly over that bearing edge, but it also means that you have little bits missing, sharp edges inside there that can, over a period of time, really shorten the length, the lifespan of your drum head too. So having that checked out, and if those things are damaged, I'm definitely not going to dive into working bearing edges on my own drums at all. That's something that I leave to the experts. So, find who in your area happens to do drum repair work and get those bearing edges cleaned up.
What so for let's use floater again for an example, because it is a rock thing, and I know we have a lot of rock fans out there. What head combinations do you use for a more rock thing versus a jazz thing? And so it's okay to use brand specific names if you want to.
Yeah, sure. I'll just say, refer to the Remo stuff that I'm using all the time, and every company's got their equivalents of everything that I'm sure are fantastic. But I am a huge fan of the Remo ambassadors on the bottom side of just about everything I play, the clear ambassadors. It's not very often that I stray from that. It's just something that has always worked for me, and I've never messed around with. The exception would be the bottom of my snare drum heads. Those tend to be the Diplomat snare side head, so that it's super, super thin. And don't go grab a regular clear ambassador and put on the bottom of your snare drum head, and you have this thick head that just does not engage with the snares under there. It's just never going to sound good. You just end up with this muddy, horrible snare drum sound. But now, on the top heads, that is a different story. The batter heads that I'm playing on top of my kit, in many situations, are constantly changing. And that is because I get sick of any one sound after a period of time. And sometimes it's changing specifically for a gig, a particular gig, or a sound I want to get on a recording. But I love clear ambassadors on top. But sometimes if I want to get a little bit punchier, I'll move to the clear Emperor. And then sometimes even with the recording customs, I just long for a little bit of a warmer sound, and I go back to the coated ambassadors, and those are great. So on the road, playing with floater, for instance, even on that rock gig, I am hitting harder and I change heads more often, but I really love the sound of the coated ambassadors for that particular band. And their sound, drum-wise, tends to be punchy, but also have a little bit of warmth and ring to it. So I'm doing almost zero muffling on the drum set whatsoever. There's a little bit in the kick drum, but the toms have next to nothing. We're doing internal mics in there. We're just trying to capture as much of the natural tom sound as I can. Snare drum, normally a brass snare drum that's wide open, almost no tape or anything on it. Not always workable in every single situation, but when you're pushing through a wall of sound of guitar and bass, at the receiving end of that, the listener hears this amazing sounding snare drum. They don't hear all the ring that I might hear on stage during sound check. And luckily, we're in in-ear land as well. So, with that, I kind of get that sound dialed in. But snare drum, coated ambassadors for me almost all the time.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool. Got a couple questions here. One from Kimberly Brooks Brower out there in Ventura, California.
Kimberly!
And she's asking, what are your thoughts on using pillows or any other kind of muffling device in a bass drum, and how best to use products like a moon gel or some kind of drum tack or some kind of dampener on drums, possibly?
Yeah, cool. I'll start with the moon gel thing. There are certainly purists who, I was just talking about using no muffling on my toms, often with floater. There are purists who say to never use anything, a moon gel or tape or anything like that. And I totally disagree with that, because when you're in the recording studio, you do whatever you have to do to get the sound to create. And sometimes that means taking the Jesus out of a tom or a snare drum to get this tone that the engineer, the producer, the artist wants. And I am not above doing that if it gets the end result that we want. There are arguments that you can always fix it in the tuning. You can always kind of tune it out, but there really is only so much that you can do with that. You can tune up that brass snare drum, but it's not going to sound really dead and dry unless you do some muffling on it. So I think it's a really smart idea to have all sorts of different dampening options available. I love those Roots EQ rings that are a little metal hoop with cloth inside, and they also do a full one that covers the entire head. They do bandana colors and things. Having some of those on hand is great. moon gels for sure, all the big fat snare drum donuts and the full head are great. And if you're working in the studio, having those at your disposal, I think is a must because you need to very quickly get good sounds for people. As far as bass drum with pillows go, yeah, I mean, especially in a rock situation, a regular pillow I have in this bass drum here, I just have a fairly small packing blanket, and I can easily move it to touch both heads if I want, or press it further back or forward if I choose. Having a little dampening is great for most of those situations. Remo, Evans, all these companies are making different little dampening devices that you can Velcro in or press into your drum different ways. And again, I think it's important to have available.
Cool. Your brother Michael says hello, and he's proud of you, by the way. Dave Stark has a question, and Sharon Powers says, it's great being able to see and hear my son on the drums. Super great. So,
oh, Mom.
The family showed up.
Mom's watching.
That's nice. Hey, Dave wants to know if you have any opinion on head selection based upon either the venue that you know you're going to be playing at, or maybe you know that you're going on tour and you're going to be playing in bigger venues versus smaller clubs, or the idea of if you're going to be using mics or no mics, if you have an idea about head selection for those categories.
Oh, yeah, interesting. That's great. As far as the mics go, especially with recording, yeah, and I think it would depend on the type of style that I'm playing for sure. But I also think it kind of fits probably with the choices I would make anyway. But if I'm doing a little bit more of a folk or jazz sort of thing, and I want a little warmer tone, less punch, and I know that there might be a kick mic out front and an overhead or something like that, I think that it wouldn't change my head selection quite as much, but it really might change the way I dampen things. Because if there is not going to be a close mic on something that I'm going to be able to get more volume out of later, I might leave it more open. So I might just dampen a little bit less in some of those kind of situations. If I know that things are being ultra close mic'd and I've got top and bottom snare and I've got a kick mic and maybe a Solomon low freak, sub kick out front, and a lot of these options, in some of those situations, I'll dampen more because I know that there's plenty of opportunity later on down the road for those to be individually kind of supplemented by other post-production work and stuff like that. So I wouldn't say it affects my head selection quite as much as what I do to them.
Sure.
And there was another part of that, I think.
About if you know what venue you're playing in, like versus if you were going to be playing in a maybe you were going on a small club tour versus an arena run.
I would say that that would again affect my dampening for sure. And then playing with floater in larger rooms, I definitely will err sometimes on those towards those heavier heads, so the Emperor and stuff like that, because I know I'm going to be just kind of slamming in there. We do have sound reinforcement, but at the same time, I just want that sound to be bigger. That said, just a little bit of a funny anecdote. There is a place in Salt Lake City that some of you may have played called Liquid Joe's. Whenever I go play Liquid Joe's, I take myself an extra big, fat, heavy snare drum head. I will take like an Emperor coated snare drum head, which is not what I normally play, but because one time I busted a snare head there right after starting, but it was a house kit, and we all know how house kits get abused. And just a song or two into a set, I busted a top snare head. Wasn't really even playing as hard as I do in other situations, and that is not what you want to do at the top of a show, especially subbing with artists that you don't normally work with. It was a little bit of a terror for a moment. So I mailed them a fresh head when I got home. And every single time I go back since then, I take a coated Emperor along with me. And I know that I've got one that will survive the gig, and I feel it's just kind of paying it forward for whoever comes in the Liquid Joe's for the future. So,
well done. That's very kind of you to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, Lord knows we walk into plenty of situations with house kits, and I always bring my snare drum just to be safe. I know it's sometimes hard, especially if it's a fly-in thing, but it's always good to at least have that, and you look and see what you got, and then you adjust as you need to. Guys, if you got any more questions, throw them at us right now. If not, we'll talk a little bit more, and then we'll wrap this thing up. So let me think of another good question to ask you. We talked about the band director situation a little bit. What is your recommendation for drumheads for a band program that you know where maybe they don't have a whole lot of money? Here we go. Okay, Joshua's got a question. Let me wrap up my question real quick. What's a good recommendation for concert snare and maybe concert toms and stuff like that for a drumhead selection for a school that is going to want to like invest their money for the long term as much as possible?
Right. Honestly, my go-to just general head that I think sounds great on lots of things is that coated ambassador. If the school has a variety of snare drums and is on a budget and doesn't want to have to be keeping track of what specific drum heads are going on different drums, having a couple of ambassadors on hand all the time I think is smart. And those work great on concert toms as well. I mean, you certainly can use clear, but if you have some 14-inch ambassadors on hand that are coated, that's going to be able to be thrown on a 14-inch concert tom if you need it, if everything else is coated, or on any snare drums that pop up as well. So that's just like my go-to general fix-all.
Cool. Joshua has an interesting question. And this is this may be kind of cost prohibitive for some schools, but he's asking about, is there a good general head selection or rule for those school kids who rehearse in the band hall, and then when they go play their concert, they're playing in a larger venue? I guess that might be more of a tuning question too. I mean, if you think about you're in a band room, which is a relatively general size room, and then when you get to the concert hall, obviously more echo, more spread.
Yeah, I think
kind of situation.
That kind of goes back to what we were talking about using different heads for different venues. In the band room, I would more likely than not have some muffling going on in there in the smaller space. But I would say that would be the biggest change when I go into a larger. It depends on how much that room reverb, how much reverb you get in that room. If you get into it and it's just a big gymnasium hall and you touch the drum and that's kind of all you hear, then again, I'm going back to not being a purist and I'm going to muffle up that snare drum or bass drum or whatever and save everybody from that. But if that's not the case, if it's actually a pretty good room acoustically, then you might be able to open that drum up compared to how you had it in the band room because you've got more space and you want that to be heard through, again, all the noise of the other instruments. But all of that, I think, is just a case-by-case basis. It really depends on the room so much in those situations.
Sure. And to elaborate on that, I know that in my previous high school and actually middle school band situations, we've actually brought a carpet and put it underneath the snare drum to help kind of suck up some of that sound as the kid's playing. Because how in middle school kids, technique and touch is a little bit, the range is kind of broad as opposed to high school kids that might have, a little bit more of a touch.
Right.
But the carpet actually is a big thing too under the snare drum. That's a big help too. Yeah. I got a couple more questions here. Shanley just jumped on and they're asking about what type of drum key do you use? Obviously, there's many different types. And what do you think of other devices like Drumdial, which we kind of touched on a little bit, but maybe we could just review about that for tuning. Obviously, you said Drumdial is kind of hard to use maybe on a gig situation.
Yeah.
But maybe you can use it for a situation like this where we're just kind of sitting down and just touching heads.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're just in your studio and you don't have a lot of other noise, I think something like the TuneBot, which I've shown here, is fantastic. It's just a little electronic gadget that you clip onto the drum, and you're doing the same thing I was talking about earlier where you're tapping around the shells, but this shows you what frequency you're getting. And you can choose to, if you get one you think you're going to like, you can lock it. So then when you move to the other lugs, it shows you how far flat or sharp of that you are. Kind of like using a guitar tuner. You see that little dial back and forth. And it works great. It's really awesome. It's fantastic. As I mentioned earlier, not always practical on the gig. You're setting up a sound check and trying to whip stuff up and everybody's in a hurry and you're being pummeled by audio from everybody else as well. And sometimes it's just your ear down next to the drum to pull it off. The Drumdial, which some of you may be familiar with, is a little different. It's a kind of a heavy little metal gadget with a gauge on top of it. So it's not a digital unit, and you set it down on your drum, and there's a little pin underneath that just feels the pressure. So that one you totally can use on a situation where there is other noise going on, because it's just being based on that pressure. You would still want to make sure it's a situation where you can be pulling that drum off and setting flat as you're setting it down, rather than try to hold it up against your toms on the kit or something. But I think that if the situation, you know, warrants or allows those to be used, I think they're fantastic. But I would not ever let that be used as a crutch and not learn how to do this yourself by ear and touch, by feel. Like, you want to be able to tune your instrument.
Sure. Yeah, exactly. Kelly Ray Tubbs is chiming in. I think we sort of touched on this a little bit, but she says, if you're like me, you have several different drum sets and use them for very different purposes. How does your tuning strategy change for different genres of music? And I think we sort of mentioned that maybe some of your Yamaha stuff, your newer stuff, is maybe more of a rock thing, and you have your vintage kit for the jazz thing. But can you just maybe touch on that again a little bit? Because I know we have some late people showing up.
Yeah. First of all, Kelly Ray Tubbs, hello. Awesome. And we did mention a little bit earlier, but just a really dumbed down synopsis of it. For most of the drums that I'm getting more of a rock sound from, I'm going a little bit tighter on the bottom or resonant head than I am on the top or batter head that I'm hitting, just so that I can get that lower punchy sound, but the tension on the bottom starts to eliminate a little bit of the sustain, a little bit of the ring. So I just kind of get that rock punch that I want. In more of a jazz situation, the heads might more often be the same type of heads. They might be tuned to the same tension and pretty close to the same pitch, just so that pitch really just does ring out a little bit. I want it to be warmer. I want the drums in that situation to be a little bit more melodic. And I guess something we didn't touch on earlier when we were talking about the pillow and the bass drum is that situation in a jazz situation would be when I would almost never use a pillow inside, because I want that pitch of the bass drum to be another note that I can play melodically on the kit and not just be a punch, not a thump. So in that situation, there's either no muffling, or I'm doing a strip of felt, kind of old school style, across the heads, maybe even both if it's thin enough. Again, experiment for yourself to figure out what feels best and sounds best to you. And then going back to the miking in those situations as well, kind of tying all these things together. If I get into a situation and I'm tracking something and it's more of a jazz sound, I'm going to fight an engineer who's going to try to put a mic right up on that bass drum. You know, I don't want a big punchy sound. I'm really going for a roomier and a more warm sound. So you want those room mics and a couple of overheads. And if there's a kick mic, it's out a few feet in front of the bass drum. Whereas in the rock situation, more often than not, I might still have some room sounds, or some room mics, but I'm going to get a bunch of close mics and be able to, after the fact, just control all of those different sounds.
Great. Awesome. Any other questions, guys? We might start thinking about wrapping this up so we can all go to lunch. Okay. Well, Mark, thanks again for joining us today. We really appreciate you taking the time to be with us. I tell us where you are. I think we're all curious about this gray prison-like wall behind you.
Yeah, it is my developing drum studio here in Portland, Oregon, and I'm awaiting a couple huge boxes of Orlex foam right now. We just built this space. I kind of did the wall inside a wall inside a wall and put in flooring, and this is the first thing I've kind of got to do here. So thanks for inviting me on today. This is awesome.
Yeah, and we want to see some more pictures. So follow Mark Powers on Instagram and Facebook and everywhere else you can find him. Let me do a little outro here. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us for the Percussive Art Society's Fundamental Friday. If you're looking for more resources, make sure to join, rejoin, or renew your PAS membership online at pas.org. As a percussion community, it is vital that we continue to support PAS, especially now in this crazy, crazy wild time. Keep an eye on the Facebook page and Instagram page for more fundamental stuff, for more PAS Presents, everything else. We got a lot of good stuff coming up next few weeks. I know we're going to be releasing a lot of the drum set videos from last year's PASIC in a smaller form that you can all check out. And it was an amazing convention. So again, pas.org. And again, Mark, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, man.
See you all next time.